right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Long, and I'm going to take this opportunity for this 10 talk to talk about a journey in optimizing my SSH experience. Does everyone know what SSH is? No? Come on. So SSH is a remote, what's that? Telnet. See, it's secure Telnet, that's what it is. So with these 10 talks, there's a lot of content in this one, so before I start, I want to let you know all the resources that I use for this presentation is on the slide, so if you're interested in following up and checking some of the concepts out that I go through, here's the resources, and of course you can always reach out to me directly and I'll be glad to answer any questions. So the objective I had was, I was learning about doing some security studies and learning about different ciphers and key exchanges and all that fun stuff. So I wanted to increase the security of SSH connections, but I also wanted to optimize the user experience. So sometimes that's kind of they don't mesh, right? So sometimes you want to increase security. Usually it's harder for users to work with. But actually this worked out pretty cool. So the key components of SSH connections is you have symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is when it takes there's part input from a client and part input from the server. They create a symmetric key. That key is used to then encrypt the data that's passed back and forth between the server and the client. Asymmetric encryption is used for authentication. So some people get those mixed up, but the asymmetric encryption is actually used for the authentication part of this. And then you have hash-based message authentication codes. And what those are used for is to maintain integrity of all the messages that are passing back and forth between the client and the server. With the SSHD config file, which is the main configuration file for your SSH servers, there's some really quick things that you can do to increase the overall security of your SSH server. You can do things like configure alternate ports, disable root login, disable password-based logins. Of course, if you disable your password-based your password login, ensure that your public key works. Otherwise, you're going to lock yourself out. Hopefully, you would have physical access to that box. You can also configure and prioritize the ciphers that are used, message authentication codes, as well as the key exchange algorithms that are used. When it comes to SSH keys, one of the resources I point to on that resource slide is the InfoSec Mozilla dev page for best practices for SSH. They recommend that if backwards compatibility is a requirement, to use RSA keys that are 4096 in size. If backwards compatibility is not a requirement, use the newer ED25519 keys. The cool thing about that is those new keys, they're 256 bits, so they're much smaller, and you get the equivalent protection of an RSA 3072-bit key. With your private keys, you always want to ensure you have key protection by using a strong passphrase. So there comes one more thing, right? So if I'm going to use a key, I got to use a passphrase. So how can we optimize the use of a passphrase so I don't have to enter it every time I make a remote connection? We're going to use what's called an SSH agent. If you're using Mac or Linux, that's built in. You can simply use the SSH add command to add your private key to the SSH agent. In OS X, you also have the opportunity to add your private key to the keychain. In Windows, you would use the Paget utility. Another really cool thing that I came across, I was reading the book SSH Mastery by Michael W. Lucas and watched one of his videos from a user group presentation he did. And he mentioned this plugin, which is called PAM SSH Agent Off. And what this allows you to do is actually forward your SSH agent session using your public key, thus negating the need to enter a password anytime you needed to use sudo. So what's cool about that is I have a remote session, I'm using public key authentication, I get rid of my password, I then log into the remote box, and I need to run a sudo command, and I don't need to enter my password. To do that, obviously, you need to get this module onto your SSH server, your Linux or Mac. You need to make a one-line edit in the etc pamd sudo file and a one-line edit in the etc sudoers file. And of course, when we edit that file, we're always using best practices of sudo vi sudo. Never try to open that file directly. Lastly, there's a lot of things to remember there. You can compile all of this stuff into an SSH config file. So you don't have to remember what the username is to log in, where I'm pointing to my private key, the port, and if I'm going to forward my agent, you can just create a simple file and SSH to that. So, enough slides, because slides are boring. Let's actually do this. All right. We see that? All right, so this is the SSHD config file. This is the main configuration file for your SSH server. You can see up top, we've got the port directive. You guys can see that, right? Looks like it's cut off. Okay. We've got the port directive here. I'm going to use an alternate port of 2222 for this demonstration. The permit root login directive, I'm going to set that to no, which means that a root user cannot directly log in over SSH. I'm going to set the password authentication directive to no as well. That way you can't use a username and password to log in. But again, remember, test your keys first. And then next, again, from the InfoSec Mozilla best practices for SSH, they make recommendations for key exchange algorithms, ciphers, and MACs, message authentication codes, depending on the version of SSH that you're running. I have really streamlined this one. There's only a couple here that I've configured, but you can go to the site, you can see what version you're running, copy and paste them in, and you can increase the security very quickly on your server. Next, we are going to look at the etc pamd.sudo file. You have to enter one line of configuration. And this is basically telling this application that you can point to the PAM SSH Agent Off module and then point that to your authorized keys file. So now it's going to use your key to do your authentication, and you don't need a password. One last little thing left you've got to do in your etc sudo file. We're going to forward the SSH authorization socket to the server. So that enables the key to go through, the socket to be used, and then now you can go ahead and use the public key as opposed to the password. All right, so let's get the log going. And let's go ahead and log in. So to do all of this, we're going to use an alternate port. -A. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm SSH in. I'm going to use the alternate port of 2222, my username, the host, and I'm going to use the -A flag, which is going to forward the SSH agent. Public key denied. That's because this is demo time, and I did this like 20 times before I came up here. All right, so, and it's a good reason because I can't type my name. So this SSH add -L flag tells you that your key is loaded, and you can load multiple keys in there. So this time, it's not blog. There we go. All right, so I've successfully SSH'd in. I can see who am I. I can check to see if the socket is enabled. We can see right here the SSH off sock. SSH off sock is there. And if I needed to change to root, it does not ask me for a password because I've forwarded and used my public key for authentication. So it saves a lot of typing. All right, so I'm going to escape out of that, and we can make this a little bit easier with the config file, and I'll show you that real quick. So here I made a host, UB1. I put all of the directives in there that I used for that connection. So now, all I have to do is type SSH UB1 and done. And I'm right on 0. All right. That's it. Thanks, guys.